Okay, enough of the puppets. We'll have some teaching now. No puppets from me, guys. I'm sorry. Matthew chapter 16 brings us to a point here where it says Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, and we gather immediately that his disciples are with him because he asks them a question. Jesus' disciples have been following him ever since Jesus invited them to follow. This is all the way back in chapter 4. Here we are in chapter 16, and they're still at it. Good for them. They haven't given up. They haven't turned it around. They haven't quit on Christ. They've been following him for some time now. Following Christ, when I say that, I really mean learning to obey. That's what following is. Let's not make any mistakes here. When a person follows Christ, what Christ is doing is teaching them to obey. That's what following really means, okay? Allowing Jesus to tell you what to do and say and think, really. No one's a follower of Christ who won't obey. I hope you would agree with me when I say that. No one is a follower of Christ who won't obey the Christ that they're following. Christianity begins with obedience. James writes a letter in Scripture telling us that without obedience, our faith is a sham. He says that without works, your faith is dead. And the 12 that follow Christ here in our chapter have learned to do that. They've learned to obey, not just follow Christ in some sort of manner, but to really obey his commands. When Jesus told them to pray, they did. They prayed. And when Jesus sent them out to preach, they preached. When Jesus told them to feed the 5,000, they fed the 5,000. When he commanded them to feed the 4,000, they fed the 4,000. When they were finished and he commanded them to cross the lake in a rowboat, that's what they did. They crossed the lake. They were obedient. They had learned how to do it. Obedience is in the details, folks. We can't just say that we obey Christ because we, did something that is marginally required of all Christians. We showed up to church, and so we count that as following Christ, and that we are therefore obedient. I would tell you that obedience is in the details. And these men were well trained in obedience after following Jesus now for as many chapters as we've been reading, which would equate to some 2.5 years in real time. They've been following Jesus for a couple years, and now they have once perfected the art of obedience, there is no issues there. Now they've got to learn to do something else, and that is to lead. They've proven that they have the ability to follow Christ, but now do they have the ability to lead? Because Jesus would be leaving soon, within about a year. He wouldn't be around forever. These men are going to be left without him, and they need to learn how to now lead God's people. And so Jesus wasn't going to be around forever. He knows that. He won't be there to tell them what to do and how to do it and where to go and what to say, like he has been for 2.5 years. And so if these men ever hope to become the leaders that they aspire to be, they're going to need to learn how to act on their own. Act on their own. Does that sound good to some of you? With an independent spirit, you'd like to, get to the part where you're just kind of thinking for yourself and acting on your own. If you like living a life of independence like that, that's probably half the reason Christ called you into obedience in the first place, to knock that out of you and reteach you how to think, so that by the time you get back around to thinking on your own, it isn't unholy like it used to be. It's righteous and good and godly. Same with the way that you act. So let me say something to those of you that are ambitious, some of you who might aspire to leadership one day. No one gets to bypass obedience in a hurry to become a leader. You will learn it. And if you become a leader, it will be without God's blessing, should you refuse to learn how to obey. It's been this way for all of God's servants. It was 40 years in the desert for Moses, learning to obey God in the heat of the day. It was 40 years of following Moses for Joshua, who wasn't allowed to enter into the promised land with God's people until he had put in 4 hard decades of service to a man with, might I say, a bit of a temper, at least we have evidence to suggest. Timothy wasn't given control of the church in Ephesus, speaking of New Testament era, until he had spent, I would say, all of his 20s and probably the better part of his 30s following the Apostle Paul. If you want to know how important it is to learn how to follow and how to obey, I'll remind you that even Jesus himself followed for 30 years before he was given any disciples of his own to lead. The Bible says in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8, that Jesus himself had to learn obedience. Did you know that Jesus had to learn how to obey? It probably isn't for the same reasons that you and I do. I don't think Jesus was stubborn and resistant and sinful like we are, thus necessitating our need to learn how to obey. Jesus' need to learn how to obey came from the fact that he had always been only in the position of godhood his entire existence and suddenly became a man beneath the authority of God and needed to learn how to obey like he would then require of all of us. Jesus was no hypocrite, asking us to do what he himself wasn't willing to do first. And so, obedience becomes a very important issue in the life of a Christian disciple. One of the biggest errors that a church can make, I think, in this issue is to appoint somebody as a leader before they've really committed to being a follower, before they've learned how to obey. They can't give orders rightly until they've learned to take them precisely. And many churches have had that mistake made. They've commissioned a leader too soon, against the warning that Paul made to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:22. Never be in a hurry to appoint a church leader, he says. Never be in a hurry to appoint a church leader. They first need to learn how to follow. And the Bible indicates that that takes years to learn, even decades. You will never be God's leader if you will not be Christ's follower. And that means obedience. The Bible has much to say about obedience. Colossians 3:22, servants, obey your earthly masters in everything. Everything, no exceptions. Learn to obey, even on a human level. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14 tells us to act like, quote, obedient children. And that might feel a little belittling to some of us who like to think of ourselves more as adults. And God comes along and says, act like obedient children, because it's just that crucial. 2 John chapter 1, verse 6 says, walk in obedience. The idea of walking means that it's continual, that it's ongoing, that we're to be paced and progressing in our obedience. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9 says, I wrote what I did to test you, to see whether you're obedient in everything. God will test you in these things. And if you're not obedient, that means you fail the test. This is for all disciples. This is for all Christians. We are to learn uncompromising, unquestioning, uncritical obedience toward the masters we serve. And that always precedes leadership. So anybody in here who has some sort of ambition to one day become a leader, a church leader, a youth group leader, a pastor, a missionary, some sort of leader of any kind, please understand that if you're a Christian, then you must be a follower first. Learn to obey. Well, these men did. These 12 have passed the test. Congratulations, right? I think they kind of deserve a bit of a round of applause. It's commendable that they've passed that test, because not many will. Not many will tolerate being told what to do, being expected to think what is expected of them to think, to act like they should, to say what is needed. A lot of people won't tolerate that, but these men did. They have passed that test, and now Jesus is training them to think. He's training them to lead, and he's training them to now act on their own. To act on their own. Jesus isn't interested in puppets, and some people, frankly, are like puppets. As soon as the ventriloquist leaves the stage, they're as good as dead. As soon as the puppeteer no longer shows them what to do, how to act, what to speak, how to speak, they're no good. Jesus is training his men, as he would for all disciples, how to think, how to act, without having to be told hand over hand. So Jesus comes into the region of Caesarea Philippi. He asks his disciples and he says, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am. And so they said, well, some say that you're John the Baptist. We've talked to some people who think that you're Elijah. Other people think Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. And so then Jesus says, who do you say that I am? That's a big question. He turns the tables and points the finger and he says, I want to hear from you. So he begins by asking his disciples what other people think. Now remember, Jesus is teaching his men to think for themselves. And he begins by asking them, what do other people think? And he gets several answers. It's always been that way. Leave church today and go out there into the community and start asking people what they think of Jesus. You're going to get several answers. You're going to get a variety of different opinions and suppositions about Jesus Christ, and I'll tell you this, every last one of them is inaccurate. They're all wrong. And I'll tell you why, because they don't know him. Go ask the world what they think of Jesus. Oh, this and that, and some opinions are more flattering than others. They're all wrong. Jesus is a prophet. Really? You're wrong. You're wrong. He was God. Well, he's John the Baptist. No, he's not. John's dead. And by their own admission, well, we think he's John the Baptist, we think that he's Elijah, we think he's Jeremiah, they're proving that they don't know Jesus any better than they know a martyred Baptist or a dead prophet. They don't know him. They're just guessing. People always guess about Jesus Christ because they don't know him until they've met him. So the world goes on guessing when it comes to Jesus, but let me have your attention here. Not us. We're not guessing. We know who Jesus is. That's why Jesus asks them specifically, what do you say? Because Jesus anticipates that their answer is going to be different than the one they're getting in the world. He has a right to expect that you, as a born-again Christian, have a different opinion, a different answer, an altogether different assessment of Christ than the world would. And he knows that of his disciples, and that's why he challenges them and says, what do you think? Now, if you don't have a different opinion of Jesus than the average worldling out there, you might ask yourself why that is. You think he's a prophet? Then you don't know him. You think he's a good guy? You don't know him. You think he's a miracle worker? You don't know him. Until God has revealed to you that Jesus Christ and God the Father are one and the same, you don't know him. But we do. If you're born again, we actually know him. Because of our knowledge of Christ, Christians should be the most unique, free-thinking people on the planet. Everyone else is just a parrot. They just mimic what they hear other people saying. Plagiarizing each other's opinions. They heard this from somebody else. Some say John the Baptist. People are saying John the Baptist. Why? Because other people are saying he might be John the Baptist. Herod thought he was John the Baptist. Apparently, word spread, and people go, "Well, he's John the Baptist." Well, why do you think that? Well, because I don't know. Somebody heard Herod say it. Well, I think he's Jeremiah. Why do you think that? Well, I heard somebody say that, and it makes sense, and I just guess he's Jeremiah. Yeah, but you've never met him. He ain't Jeremiah, right? So, but that's what the world does. They just plagiarize each other's arguments and opinions and catchphrases. They repeat what they've heard other people say without giving it a second thought. They don't think for themselves. I don't quote from the Good News Translation very often, but this one works really well. Proverbs 4, verse 23 says this, "Be careful how you think. Your life is shaped by your thoughts." And you know what? I've met a lot of people who don't really care they're not careful about what they think. I run into a lot of people who believe in Jesus and don't know why. Borrowed arguments, borrowed opinions, borrowed catchphrases. They learned it in Sunday school, and that's just what they believe because that's what somebody else believed. You know what else? I've heard a lot of people who reject Jesus reject Jesus based on another borrowed argument. Well, I don't think that Jesus is the only way to God. I believe that all paths lead to the top of the mountain. That's original. Yeah, I've never heard that one before. Think for yourself. Do you really believe that all paths lead to the top of the mountain? Do you really believe that we all go to the same place? Do you really believe what other people believe about Jesus? Or have you actually read the Bible, thought it through, and formulated opinions for yourself? My goodness, what a dangerous game to play when we don't. It's eternity at stake. Eternity. And no one goes to heaven for being lazy and careless about figuring things out while they're alive. Jesus isn't flattered. I needn't tell you that, but I'll say it nonetheless. He's not flattered when his own followers simply echo what the world says. And he isn't satisfied with an answer like that, so he says to his disciples, "What do you think?" What if Jesus was around today to just point his finger at you, particularly, and ask you, "What do you think?" What do you think? Jesus ain't around to point his finger in your face. You should be doing it to yourself. Ask yourself, what is it that you think this morning about Jesus? What do you believe? Jesus wants us to contemplate these things and to seek Creator God for an answer. And Jesus is waiting for us to start letting God influence our thoughts. In verse 16, Simon Peter answers him and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And it's at this point that I think Jesus jumped out of his chair, if he was sitting down. I read verse 17 like this. Jesus answered and said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you. My Father who is in heaven did." Jesus is waiting for evidence in all of his disciples, both then and now, that God is actually influencing your thoughts now, not the world anymore. That it's God who's teaching you how to think and what to say and how to do this, rather than the world. And if you are so foolish to say that, well, the world doesn't influence me, that's proof that it does. The whole world would say that. I'm unique. I'm an individual. Yeah, just like everybody else. I'm different. Just like my whole peer group. All my friends, we're like this. This is what we think. This is what we believe. Jesus is waiting for the day that his disciples begin to think for themselves thoughts that have been influenced by his Father in heaven. And that's what happened with Peter right now. I dare say that Jesus is a little excited. I mean, when one sinner comes to faith, the Bible says all of heaven erupts. It's like the Super Bowl, but way bigger. The stadium is bigger up there. It's a bigger, there's not a limit to the seats. It's not like there's a max capacity, 40,000. And all of heaven erupts with applause and with cheers when somebody gets it, finally. And Jesus is excited. I don't think that he really cares about people's assessment of him and what people think of him. I don't think Jesus' ego was that fragile. What do people think of me out there? What are they saying out there about me? What do you think about me? Do you like me? I don't think that was Jesus' deal. I don't think he really gives a rip about people's assessment of him as much as he cares about reconciling those people to God. That's his goal. That's his goal, okay? And that's what he came to do. He didn't come into this world to promote himself, like, I'm awesome, everybody. Hey, his concern is what they think really of God. His concern is to glorify God. His concern was to serve God. His concern was to save man by reconciling them to God. And if a person won't be reconciled to God, well, what does it matter who they think Jesus is? Right? You can think Jesus is great, the best prophet there ever was. You could think that Jesus was a miracle worker and a wonderful teacher, and there is, Jesus was one unlike anybody else, bar none, the best man that's ever walked the face of the earth. Fine. But if you're not reconciled to God, guess where you still go? You're saved from God's wrath by being reconciled to God. There's a lot of people who say the right things about Jesus that are still alienated from God. That's what Colossians 1 says. And still abiding under his wrath. John 3. So we need to be careful that, okay, yes, and congratulations us, we have a correct assessment of Jesus, don't we? Peter didn't tell us anything new in verse 16, did he? Did he? We know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, right? So great. You have a proper assessment of Jesus Christ. That's not the question this morning. That's not Jesus' concern. His concern, are you reconciled to my Father? Are you reconciled to God? Has the relationship that was ruined through sin been fixed? Well, this, I would suggest to you, is a major turning point in Peter's life, that God now has more influence over Peter's thoughts than the world does, and Jesus recognizes that in him, and it's a relief to Christ. I believe that this is what he's aiming at in his training of the disciples before he leaves. He's trying to wean them from the need for a human teacher to be at their side all day, every day, telling them what to think and do. It's critical that his disciples get to a point where they don't need Jesus, humanly speaking, because humanly speaking, Jesus won't be around in a year from now. Okay? If you're not familiar with the story, I'm going to spoil it for you. He's going to get killed. Humanly speaking, Jesus is going to die. And they won't have the luxury of having a physical rabbi next to them, safeguarding them from the doctrine of the Pharisees, and, oh, be careful of this, be careful of the leaven, be careful of this, think this, don't think that, do this, now go here, now say these things, now I'm going to send you out to and do this when you get there, and don't take this stuff with you, but take this stuff with you. What are they going to do in a year if Jesus dies and they're left going, well, I don't know, you need, did anybody record the stuff he said? Jesus is training them still. He goes on in verse 18 and says, and I also say to you that you are Peter. At this point, Peter's got to be like, yeah, I know. You are Peter, and on this rock, I will build my church. This passage has puzzled many for a long time. Not just what I read here, but what comes at the rest of verse 18 and through on 19. Lots of things Jesus is saying here that have left people wondering what exactly he meant. The Catholics have hijacked this passage and made believe that Peter is being designated by Jesus as the first pope, and that all popes in succession have come from him, and that simply isn't true. I think that there would be less confusion if the Catholics hadn't ever done that. It's inaccurate. But what does Jesus mean when he says, I say to you that you're Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church? I'll tell you what he means. First of all, if you go and look at the original Greek language, the word Peter is a particular word that means pebble. Pebble. And the word rock that Jesus uses just after that means a great solid rock cliff. Mega. Jesus is going, you're a pebble, but I'm going to build my church on the rock. And what does rock mean? Well, not Peter. Not Peter. Someone else. Jesus. Come on. Do you really think the church has been built on Peter? God, help us if it has. Wait till we get to next week. In just a few short verses, Jesus is calling him Satan. So I'm sorry if you're Catholic. But it ain't Peter. Rock, in fact, is the common Old Testament name for God. And they would have been well aware of that. Because when Jesus is talking to these people in Matthew 16, the New Testament wasn't written yet. They had no New Testament. All they had was Old Testament. So when the word rock is used, I'm going to build my church on this rock, they knew what it meant. It meant God. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4, starting in verse 4, it says, "The rock, his work is perfect, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity." And then throughout the rest of Deuteronomy chapter 32, the word rock is used 4 more times referring to God. He's the rock, he's the rock, he's the rock, he's the rock, he's the rock. And then 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "There is no rock like our God." Peter doesn't compare. Jesus is the rock. There's no rock like our God, none that compares. So to bring Peter into the picture now would be embarrassing for Peter. King David saying, "God is my rock." Even you'll go on into the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, speaks of the wilderness wandering in the former days of Israel, and it says, "They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." So if there was any conjecture, still floating around out there about what did he mean when he said, "You're Peter, I'm going to build my house on the rock," Paul comes along a few years later and says, "Just so we know, the rock is Christ." Okay? Isaiah 28, verse 16 speaks of Jesus, calling him a foundation stone in Jerusalem, a firm and tested stone. It is a precious cornerstone that's safe to build on. It's safe to build on. It's been tested and found safe. That's your foundation. Let's get building. The church is built on him. The Christian church is built on Jesus as the chief cornerstone. Even Peter himself uses that language in Acts chapter 4, years after Jesus told him that he was going to build his church. Peter says that the stone is Christ. Okay, but what part does Peter play? I mean, why is Jesus singling him out? Well, you are Peter, this pebble. On this rock, I'm going to build my church. What part is it that Peter plays here? And again, there's a lot of debate. But I will tell you that as the chief cornerstone, it's Christ's right to include anyone else in the construction of the church that he chooses. And right here, he's chosen 12, one of whom is Peter. One of whom, yes, is Peter. But Jesus didn't say it to Peter until it had become obvious that God was operative in Peter's life and mind. It came right on the heels of verse 17 when Jesus recognized God's work in his mind. Then he says, "I could use you in the building of this church. Even though I'm the church chief cornerstone, I can still use you as a foundational stone. I can still use you in the construction. I can still find a place for you to fit." And I'll tell you this, Jesus will gladly build his church through anyone with that kind of spiritual stability, that has been enlightened by God and who knows and has been reconciled to his Creator, whether that's Peter or Andrew or John or you or me. Jesus will use anybody with the spiritual stability that comes with knowing God to build his church. To build his church. In fact, Peter himself goes on in life writing a letter referring to all believers as part of the church structure when he writes, quote, "You are living stones that God is building up into his spiritual temple." So the church foundation was laid with Christ as the chief cornerstone, all the apostles and prophets as additional foundation stones. Ephesians 2:20 tells us that. And then subsequent layers throughout the centuries have been built upon that. I don't know where we're at in 2023, but we're somewhere up here. Maybe we're just the shingles. I don't know. Maybe we're about done building this thing. But we are being used by God in the same church, the same spiritual temple that Jesus began building when he gave his life to serve as the chief cornerstone upon which everything else would be built and the entire structure would be trued up, starting with Peter and the apostles. And he goes on from there and says, if you're curious to know, the gates of Hades won't prevail against it. So there's nothing that's going to stop this from happening, not even the gates of hell. And while Jesus had just announced that he himself would be building this church, but if you look forward a little bit to verse 21, we're going to find out here that in just a moment he's going to be talking to his apostles about his imminent death. So I got this big construction project I'm going to be working on. Oh, by the way, I'm going to die pretty quick. Wait, okay. How does that work? You have this colossal undertaking where you're going to build this great church, but now you just said you're going to die? That's why he's saying, the gates of hell won't prevail against it. It's a euphemism for death. The gates of hell. It's a euphemism for death. So Jesus is reassuring them before he even tells them that he's going to die, that the church won't die when he does. I'm going to die in just a bit, boys, but don't you worry because I still intend to finish the building of my church that I told you I was going to construct. So when you see me on the cross, don't freak out thinking that I left unfinished business. I will continue to do the work even though I'm not physically around anymore. So guys, here's a principle for you and me. This is applicable to us. Dying doesn't stop the growth of the church. Dying does not stop the growth of the church. If anything, it actually promotes the growth of the church. It advances Christ's agenda, whether metaphorically or literally. Okay? History has proven time and time again that this is true in the literal sense. Even before the church had gotten out of the 3rd century, one of the early church fathers named Tertullian, he recognized early on the positive effect that death had on overall church growth. And so he wrote this: the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Us dying is what makes the church grow so richly. Hundreds of years later, a man named Alexander Sauter followed up saying, we spring up in greater numbers the more we're mown down. The church just keeps growing thicker and more vibrant and more numerous the more they kill us. That's literal, physical. But it's also true in the figurative sense as well. We'll deal with that next week. As your pastor, I need you to understand that if the church will ever grow, and that means both here, our little corner of the church in Duluth, and the greater universal church, there has to be an element of death among us. Jesus said, unless a corn of wheat goes into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it does die, it produces 100-fold. There must be an element of death. I don't mean that we need to go about seeking physical death to somehow honor Christ in a strange way, but what I do mean is that we are called to die to certain elements of our life that are right now alive and well and choking the spiritual vitality from us. We have great hopes and we have plans for the future. Yeah, those need to be put to death. Jesus has a different future for you than the one that you had planned for yourself. And until you can admit that, you're going nowhere but church. You go to church on Sunday, but you're not going to advance the church. And you're not going to grow as a spiritual man or a spiritual woman until there is an element of death even in your own life. That is why Christ is so willing to die himself. He knows how this works. And he's showing us, and we see it clearly. And it's also why Jesus only recruits those who are willing to do the same. You must die. I never said that these were easy concepts to understand or embrace, but they're ones that Jesus taught nonetheless. He goes on with more difficulty, and he talks about the keys of the kingdom of heaven in verse 19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. What? Again, lots of conjecture, people wondering what this means. Certainly doesn't mean that Peter or the church, including us, doesn't mean that we have free reign to select who's saved and who's not. We don't decide that. We don't get to decide who's forgiven and who's not. Only God can forgive sins. This doesn't mean that whatever we decide as a church is what God in heaven is obligated to honor. It's not how it works. It's actually the opposite. It's the church's burden to ensure that the desires of God in heaven are fulfilled on earth, here in the church. So this isn't us being given the authority to boss God around. This is Jesus telling us that God retains the authority to tell us what to do. We have the keys, i.e., the responsibility to see to it that it gets done. And keys, depending on what they unlock, are no easy thing to carry around. The church is commissioned to do what God in heaven wants us to do here on earth. If God would admit somebody into or deny somebody membership in the church, it is the church's obligation and requirement to see to it that they are accepted and or denied. If God wants discipline to be administered to somebody within the church, then it is the responsibility of the church and the right of the one needing discipline to administer that discipline. If God wants an unrepentant sinner to be excommunicated from his church, the one that he built, the one that he owns, then it's the church's responsibility to honor God by being good stewards of that church and excommunicating those that need to leave. He expects church and church leaders to do this for him. So it's ultimately God who decides what's bound or loosed. It's God who decides what's locked or unlocked in the church. Isaiah 22, verse 22 says, what he opens, no one can shut. And what he shuts, no one can open. So God is in full authority of how this works. So never read verse 19 and somehow think that heaven is supposed to ratify what the church on earth decides. It's the other way around. The church ratifies what God in heaven has decided. That's our responsibility. One online source says that if you've been entrusted with the keys to something, it isn't yours to own or to use as you will. It's yours to exercise authority over in the name of the one who entrusted the keys to you. So just because you have keys doesn't mean you own the building. You got keys on you. Some of you rent. You have an apartment. It ain't your house. The keys in your pocket right now aren't yours. They belong to somebody else. And they were given to you as a responsibility to steward the house you occupy well. Those keys were given to you with the expectation that you will keep the vandals out of that property. You won't be inviting arsonists to dinner. You'll keep the wrong people out, and you'll let the right people in. That's what you do with keys, whether they're church keys or otherwise. It's always been that way, starting all the way back with the Apostle Peter. And I'll tell you this, a church that won't fulfill God's desires in this way ceases to be a church. Can't call yourself a church if you're not doing God's will in heaven. Revelation chapter 2, Jesus addresses the church at Ephesus and actually threatens to revoke their status as a recognized church. If they don't clean their act up, he says, I'm going to remove your lampstand, which the terminology is clear as we studied through that book a while back, that Jesus is saying, I won't even count you as a church anymore. So apparently, keys can be given and keys can be taken away. Job chapter 1, verse 21 affirms that when Job says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Whether that be keys, life, anything. The keys belong to Christ. He defines himself as the key holder in various places. He gives those keys to whom he will. Peter was the first one to be given these keys, but they have been given to others. We actually, in a couple chapters from now, will study in Matthew chapter 18, verse 18, where the same language is used, the same binding and loosing language. And in that passage, he's talking to all of the apostles. So Peter wasn't the only one with that responsibility. He's speaking to all of his disciples in that passage, and by extension, all church leaders and believers that would come thereafter. After the original 12 were dead and gone, those keys would be passed to somebody else. And guys, I'm not saying anything weird about this, but that responsibility has been given to us, particularly the church leaders, even in this small little congregation in the corner of northern Minnesota. And I'm blessed to say, I hope you're blessed to hear that your leaders take that seriously. That's me and Jesse, along with the other two board members in this fellowship. We don't have a choice. That's how we see it anyway. God's will gets done in this church, or it ceases to be a God-honoring church. And I don't want that. Jesus has said enough. And then he commands his disciples in verse 20 that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. So they had just done this amazing thing. Well, we believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus, as soon as it said, well, don't tell anybody, though. Don't tell anybody. There are some things that people need to learn on their own. Jesus likes it when God teaches you stuff. That's why it's so disappointing to me, to God, when people learn nothing other than what I teach them from the pulpit. You know what Jesus wants from your life? For you to go and employ the things you've learned, apply them in your daily life, so that God can do some subsequent teaching. God longs to be your teacher. Jesus passionately desires to teach you some things that I never could. That Sunday school can't, coming to church can't, reading books, even by the best authors, because we know who those are. We have all the best ones, all the favorite books and all the favorite authors and all the favorite preachers. Are you learning anything on your own? Is God teaching you things? Is Jesus a part of your life? Am I the only instructor you got? And so he says, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. And it's a command. Did you notice that in verse 20? He commanded his disciples, just in case any of them thought that leadership and authority and key holding would free them from obedience. I give you the keys of the kingdom. I'm going to build my church. I'm going to do this and that. And by the way, just because I'm teaching you how to think and how to act on your own doesn't mean you don't have to still obey. So I command you, don't tell anybody. Because obedience never goes away. Even in your training, you'll find this, and it frustrates some people to no end. They think, I've been obedient for like 2.5 years now, Jesus. Am I beyond that now? Can I lead and tell other people what to do? That's what I want, enough of this having to take orders all the time. And Jesus would say, no, you have to take orders for the rest of your life. Obedience is always an essential ingredient in following me, whether I'm physically present or not. Romans 8:29 says that it's God's goal to make us all like Christ. You familiar with that verse? We're being conformed into the image of his Son. We're being conformed into the image of Christ. Romans 8:29. What that means is that we first have to learn obedience, like Christ did. If we're going to be conformed into his image, it's an obedient image, and we then need to learn how to obey like Jesus did. Unquestioning, uncompromising, uncritical obedience. God says, we do. Obedience, obedience. But it doesn't end there, guys. Obedience by itself isn't enough. Jesus wants more from you. He wants more for you. Okay? I get that we're slaves. The Bible says we're like slaves to Christ. That means perfectly obedient, compliant with all he says and does. But he wants you to be a friend. He wants to treat you like a child. He wants to take the relationship beyond mere obedience. Because the fact is, if that's all you got, that can get dangerous. Unthinking obedience actually keeps people from knowing God at all. Religion can make you obedient, and it doesn't matter what religion it is. All religion has rules for you to follow, and if that's all you do is follow rules, there's no reason to believe that you know who God is. There are multitudes of Jews in this world, and Muslims in this world, and Mormons in this world, and Buddhists in this world, and even Christians who are obedient without even knowing why. They do what's expected of them according to their Jewish faith or Muslim faith or Mormon beliefs or Buddhist practices or Christian religion without knowing God or why they're doing what they're doing. We're called to obey, yes, but not only obey, we're called to think. Think, why do you do what you do? We have to learn to think for ourselves, guys, which means to think like Christ does, Christian. And we need to learn how to act on our own without being forced to obey all the time. This should come a little more natural with every step that we take. We should be a little bit more excited about obedience the further we go with Christ. If we never learn to think for ourselves and we never learn to act on our own, there's no way that we'll ever learn to die by choice. And if we don't die by choice, then we won't be anything like Christ, who died by choice. We'll have more about that next week.